Welcome back to the Aussie Shed, ladies and gentlemen, for another episode of Project Fairlady. Now today, folks, I'm going to be showing you something that I've been working on for weeks and weeks to be able to get it to a point where I'm happy with it. And what that is my full flow oil cooling system that I've put together for the Fairlady. So let's have a bit of a look on the bench at what I've got going on. So what we have here, folks, is some of the stuff that was on the car when I got it. So this is your standard TT oil filter tree. Now this outlet here that has the masking tape on it, it normally has a hose that runs from that to this tiny weeny oil cooler that's mounted on the front of the vehicle. Now that is the factory oil cooler for the twin turbo cars. Now, as I say, it gets oil from this position here on the oil filter tree, and that's actually a pressure relief valve. So once the oil pressure gets up to a certain point, it then bleeds off a regulated amount through this relief valve in here, which I haven't really pulled apart. I'm pretty sure there'd be just some sort of spring and plunger arrangement in there. And that then goes to this tiny weeny oil cooler on the front of the car, and then returns back to the sump via a hose that has a restrictor in it, so you don't lose too much oil pressure through this, and then just goes straight back into the sump. So that's your standard TT oil cooler setup. Now, purely just by the size of this unit and its lack of any real heat sinking capacity due to its very small size and weight, it really is of no use to me. This is just completely incapable of being anything more than an ornament on this vehicle. Also, when I bought the vehicle, it had another oil cooling system fitted to it. So the initial setup when I bought the car was that it had the factory TT oil cooler tree. Then mounted onto the bottom of that was this sandwich plate here, which just has an oil pressure and oil temperature unit on it. And then mounted to the underside of that was a Mocal thermostatic sandwich plate, and then mounted to the underside of that was the oil filter. Now this is just a giant concoction of crap that did exactly what you would assume. It had oil leaks everywhere on it. This setup was loose, and I'd say it would have constantly been coming loose. To enable to get this to fit, they had removed the driver's side gearbox to engine block gusset, because with the gusset in place they couldn't get any lines onto the thermostatic sandwich plate in the position that they had it, because they just didn't have the space to be able to get this pile of crap to actually work. And running off the thermostatic sandwich plate, they had a small Chinese oil cooler mounted on the front of the car in the poorest fashion that you've ever seen. If you want to see it, go back to one of the first videos on the Fairlady. It's laughable the way this thing was mounted. This crappy Chinese oil cooler was mounted on the front of the car. So they had two oil cooling systems working at the same time, which is just ridiculous. There's just no point of doing that. You have one system and you have it working properly, because the amount of hoses and everything that you need to make that all sort of work, it just leads to an untidy mess, you know. And as I say, this thing had oil leaks everywhere. The hoses that they used to get to the oil cooler were fairly cheap hoses. It was all push lock stuff, which sometimes is alright, but I don't really like using it for things like, oil coolers and stuff like that. And it just leaked. There was so much oil under this car, and so many leaks coming from this setup. And it was just a mess the way it was done. It looked like it had been put together by a child. The hoses were running under the front crossmember, so they were in a very dangerous position of being hit, taking out the oil cooling system, destroying the motor, you know, just not the go. And I kind of get why they did that, because it takes a lot of effort to be able to get the lines from a thermostatic sandwich plate like this attached to the oil filter tree to the front of the car, there's not a lot of ways you can do it, and it does require you know, a little bit of nous to be able to get the whole thing to work. And that has actually led me on a bit of a journey. So first thing we'll do, we'll just get rid of this guy off the bench, and we'll get rid of this guy because we're not using that anymore. And that leaves us with the Mocal thermostatic sandwich plate. Now I have rebuilt this. These are different fittings on it than what it came with. It has a new gasket. It's been stripped and cleaned, checked, and it's all 100%. I've actually refaced it all as well because it was a little bit knocked around. So I thought to myself, okay, well, what can we do here? How can I get a full flow oil cooling system running on this car of something that's going to do what I want it to do, have enough capacity to take away the heat that I feel is going to be dumped into the oil cooling system. So this setup with this pressure relief valve and all this, just not for me. So definitely going to a full flow system, which this is not. So to do that, you need to either run a sandwich plate, or you need to get rid of the filter tree and mount a bypass plate on there, or a plate, and then feed that separately to a remote thermostat, and then to a remote oil filter mount. So initially I thought, okay, well, I'll just disable this, I'll just block up this port, you know, maybe get this apart, maybe cut it off and tap it and block it off, or whatever, because I've noticed that the naturally aspirated version of this on the JDM and Australian models looks exactly the same. It's the same size, the same shape. It just doesn't have this piece on here, which is the like the relief valve that works the oil cooler setup. So I thought, okay, well, I can either swap over to one of those, or I can just cut this off. So then I started sizing it all up with a sandwich plate like this, and trying to work out how exactly I could get the lines through to where I need to get them to start even attempting to feed them through into the front of the vehicle. And it quickly became apparent to me that the length of this, and then with the thermostatic sandwich plate on the bottom, where the hoses came out, it interferes directly with two things. All the power steering lines are all in that area, and there's also the drain back from the driver's side turbo goes across that area as well. So there's a lot of hardware in the way to stop you getting this to work. So I then embarked on a bit of a mission to try and work out how I could kind of do this. Now, another way to do it is to put a remote adapter on here, get rid of the oil filter tree, put an adapter with some AN fittings on it, and then just take that to somewhere else and remote mount the oil filter and all that sort of stuff. And I looked at that for a while, but I couldn't really work out anywhere where I could remote mount the filter and the whole thing. It was like, even that seems to be really hard. It would be better if I could just leave the filter in its location, because there is a spot there for it, but the combination of the thermostatic sandwich plate and the filter just didn't kind of work. So the next thing I thought I'd do is see if I could get hold of the US oil filter tree, which is shorter, and the only main difference is it doesn't have these little ball bearings in here, this valve arrangement. Now that's a pressure relief setup for your oil filter. So if your oil filter gets blocked, these open up and bypasses your filter. It's basically a filter bypass. There's not a lot of spring pressure on these, because they rely on differential pressure between what's going in and what's going out of your oil filter. So the issue with not having those is you need to run an oil filter that has a bypass built into it, which most oil filters do nowadays. They have a bypass valve like this in the filter, so that's not really an issue. Pretty much every filter that you can buy, or certainly would look into buying, you would just make sure that you had one that had a bypass built into it. You're actually in the same position if you just put a block on here and remote mount your oil filter. because again, you're getting rid of this. So again, you have to make sure you use filters that have a bypass built into them. So I have managed to track down a US oil filter tree. Now you can see the obvious difference in these. And this is from an NA 300zx in the US. You can see it is a lot shorter. It doesn't have the arrangement for the bypass for the oil cooler, and it's a lot shorter, and apparently it's to do with the steering arrangement or something or other. And what it meant for me was just the opportunity to see if I could actually get this to work. Because of the difference in the length, I may possibly be able to use this to get lines through to where I need them. So yeah, then we sort of came to this point, and it's like, okay, well, the next thing we need to do is mount this guy on the bottom. So that's our new setup there, folks, and you can see with those two there that there's not a lot of difference between the length of them now with the sandwich plate mounted on there, you know, but the angle is different. This is angled more flat at the bottom, and this keeps that angle so it sort of has a bit of a tilt to it, you know. So now we'll get rid of this guy because we're not working with this anymore. This hasn't been used. This is not part of my system. So this can just head off the bench. God, I don't know if you can hear the rain, guys, but it's absolutely raining cats and dogs outside. So when you get your Mocal sandwich plate, guys, it comes with these sort of fittings here on it, okay? Now, the thread on these is 1/2 inch BSP. Now, that is a parallel fitting, so it requires these Doughty seals on there to seal against the face of this, because it's not a tapered fitting, you know, so it requires some sort of a washer or an O-ring seal in order for it to fit. Great setup, pretty reliable and everything, but the problem is it's not an AN fitting. So what I did was I bought some AN10 to 1/2 inch BSP adapters and then ran these on there, and all good. That's a setup that works fine. But when I mounted this setup on the car, what I realized was, now with the new length of this thing, with these things mounted straight off the front here, it now interferes directly. Go away, rain. It now interferes directly with the oil drain off the driver's side turbo. So it basically runs straight across in front of these. So there was no way to run hoses off this and have them not interfere. You know, it just became a big problem. Now, another issue with BSP stuff is there's not a lot of angled fittings available to go straight out. You can always do what I've done here and throw a BSP to AN fitting on there, but then if you then add a hose end with an angle on it, you start building length, and we needed this, or I needed this as compact as possible. So I worked out the only way I could do this was to have an angled fitting going straight into the Mocal sandwich plate here, and I couldn't get the angled fitting that I want. These are 45s. You can't buy them, or I couldn't buy them in 1/2 inch BSP. I could, however, get them in 1/2 inch NPT, National Pipe Thread, which is a tapered thread. So it's not a parallel thread, it's a taper. So it doesn't require any sealing washers. It just threads in and tightens up and generally seals just on the tapered thread itself, but I generally always use some thread sealant on them as well. But the problem is now that these are 1/2 inch NPT and this is 1/2 inch BSP. But the good news is, folks, that with a 1/2 inch NPT tap, you can actually re-tap these. The thread size is almost identical, and because the NPT thread gets wider as it goes in further, it completely removes most of the top of the old thread and then completely re-taps it. So when these are screwed out of there, you can't tell that it's been retapped from another thread. There's just no sign of any kind of cross-threading or conflicting in the thread at all. I've absolutely no problem that this is going to seal with a bit of thread sealant on it, and quite possibly it would seal even without thread sealant, but like I say, I put thread sealant on there anyway. So what that's allowed me to do is to then get away from this oil drain hose off the turbo, because it goes basically through here. So I've now just scooted up above it. So then I can basically go over the top of it or kind of around to start the lines to try and get them through to the oil cooler. So as I say, folks, these fittings are 1/2 inch NPT to AN10. Now there's no real way to possibly get AN10 size rubber stainless braided hose through into where the oil cooler needs to be mounted in the front of the car, or I couldn't work out how to do it. There just wasn't enough clearance. So what I've done is I've gone to an AN10 PTFE hose, which is this guy here. This is a piece of the exact hose that I've used. Now this is externally the same size as AN8 stainless rubber braid. So and that follows through with all the PTFE stuff, because it's the wall thickness is so much thinner. It goes down through a lot of them. So AN8 PTFE is externally the same size as AN6 stainless braided rubber. Now this does have a stainless braid on it underneath this nylon braid. It is super durable, really super strong stuff. You can run it in basically anything. The biggest issue with it, however, is it's not very flexible. Not like a rubber hose, you know. It's really hard to bend this stuff, and it just does not want to conform, and it always wants to spring back, whereas after a while with the rubber stainless braided stuff, it'll just basically stay like that if it's been bent for a while. But not so with the PTFE stuff, or not to the same degree anyway. So even though this is dimensionally smaller, all of the bends have to be a lot smoother than what you could get away with rubber braid stuff. So you've really got to plan out your hose layouts and hopefully be able to get it through where you need it without having to put any really hard bends in it, because you're just literally not going to be able to do it. So at this point, folks, I figured I had most of the system worked out in my head, and I had a pretty fair idea that I'd be able to actually do it, which I, you know, a few times there I honestly didn't think I'd be able to, but I've managed to do it, and it's taken quite a bit of thought. I've been months on this, working this out. Obviously waiting times play a bit of a part in that, when you decide that, you know, I had to wait for a while to get these, they didn't work, and I had to wait for a while to get these, so obviously things get shelved, you move on to other stuff, you know. As I say, it's taken quite a bit of thought to be able to do it, and reconfiguring a few other bits and pieces in that area. And what I've had to do, folks, is I've had to make up some brackets to be able to mount the PTFE hose up in places to make it really secure, because there was no real way to run it and not have it securely mounted. It would have just caused too much interference with other things, and like I say, due to the lack of flexibility with it, it's really hard to kind of work it into an area without tying it back to something. This goes onto the chassis rail on the driver's side, pretty much beside where your alternator normally sits. So I just made these out of a bit of billet aluminium. I just made them on my bandsaw and drill press, basically the only tools that I used to make these. So you can see that's how it mounts onto the chassis rail there. I've got a little arrow engraved on there to just tell me which way is up with it, and I've got a couple of countersunk holes in the bottom with some M6 stainless countersunk bolts that go in there, so that mounts it up onto the chassis rail. And then this clamp on the top section goes over the top. Again, I've engraved a little arrow on there just because, as I say, this wasn't made in a fancy mill or with any kind of fancy equipment. It's just been made by hand, and even though it is quite consistent. It's not absolutely perfect. So what that means is the two pieces have to be matched. Like, you know, you can't fit this on up the other way, or there's a very, very slight mismatch. It will actually bolt together, but it's a little bit edgy in a few spots, you know. It's better off if it just all mounts the way it was kind of made, which is like that. So that's one. And then there's this other more complicated two-piece mount here, and this goes beside the radiator and holds the pipes where they go between the intercooler piping and the radiator. Again, it's just a bit of billet that I chopped up on the bandsaw and drilled out with a drill press and everything, and this is just a bit of, I don't know, 3mm aluminium sheet that I bent up, drilled a few holes in. Obviously I designed it in CAD first. You know, nice piece of cardboard bent over, a bit of cardboard aided design. Unfortunately, folks, the Aussie Shed's not one of these fancy places like a lot of the guys on YouTube who build these amazing things in CAD and then send it off somewhere to get it all bent up and then bring it back and show you what a marvellous piece of art it is and then put it on their cars. I'm not that guy. I just do everything here in-house by hand pretty much most of the time, and the beauty of it is it doesn't really cost a lot of money to do stuff that way. Anyway, so these two brackets are crucial in the setup to make what I've done work, because without these the hoses would be in the way of other things. And that's probably about all I can show you without actually starting to get this thing mounted up. So what I think I'll do, folks, is I will go and mount the oil filter tree on the car with the thermostatic sandwich plate on the bottom. I'll set a light up under there and we'll just go and assemble it, and I'll talk to you about what I'm doing and why I've had to do things in a particular way and why I've laid out stuff the way I have, so you guys can just see what I've done. Alrighty, I'll get this on the car. Oh, sorry folks, just a couple of quick things that I realised I'd forgotten before I go bolting all this stuff up. I didn't really show you the bottoms of these two oil filter trees. You can see the difference there. That's your JDM Aussie version, and that's your US domestic market model version. You can see it doesn't have the relief valve in the bottom, and that's because the relief valve, this guy with the ball bearings, it's actually in the block where this mounts on the US versions, which is why it doesn't exist on the bottom of this. And the other thing is, these are the two hoses that I've made up. As I said, they are AN10 PTFE hoses. This is the oil cooler end here with all the funky angles on it. Now you're probably thinking, what are those red stripes on there, Trevor? Well, they actually are bracket positions. Now that's just a bit of red heat shrink, and I've done that because these hoses and this whole setup has to be mounted very, very precisely in order to fit. It is that tight a thing. When it's mounted up properly, plenty of clearance, works beautifully, but because of the stiffness of these lines, it's very, very hard to get it into the right position where it all works properly. So once I had it mounted all properly and had everything working, I slipped a bit of heat shrink on and shrunk it up just so I don't lose these bracket positions. So when I mount it up, because everything's on swivels, you know, these are swivels and this is all swivelly, and it's very easy to then not have something in the right place and the thing not work. But at least with these I've got half a chance. Alright folks, I just thought I'd show you that because as it starts going along now, we'll be putting this stuff on and you probably won't get a real good look at it. Now we'll go under the car. Alright guys, so under we go. Now bear with me here because I am using my mobile phone and I'm a little bit on the shaky side. So I don't know how this is going to turn out. I've set up as many lights as I can so you can kind of see what's going on here. So you can see that's the oil filter tree mounted up there onto the side of the engine block. And this is the steering rack position here. So you can see the problems you have because you've got to get lines forward from here. Now you can kind of tell that this area here, these guys here are kind of in the way. The only way through is to sneak through where I am there. And once you get below that point, there's kind of no other way through other than, well, I couldn't work out a way through. If I was any lower than that, I just sort of couldn't sort of get my way through. And you can see this is the drain back for the turbo on this side. And you can sort of tell how it just fits through here, where if I had straight fittings on here, which is what I mentioned, that it would have interfered with this, and that allows me to get a shot with this going through and through to there. I may even have to slightly reposition that when the time comes when I'm working on the sump, because I do have a little bit of stuff planned to do the sump. That's the return line position there from the original factory oil cooler, which will be cut off and just sort of welded up. And this is the gusset arrangement that had been removed from the car when I got it. None of this was there because they'd had the thermostatic adapter turned sideways. It was the only way they could fit it with the arrangement that they sort of had on there. And they'd either gotten rid of this for that reason, which I'm fairly sure is why they did it, or they just left it off when they were sort of rebuilding the car. But I got hold of some new brackets, all new bolts, all new bell housing bolts and all that kind of stuff. I've replaced just about all the hardware on this thing. I've either bought all new bolts or replated everything. So yeah, you can see there's a lot going on in this area, which is why it's kind of so hard to actually get this set up to work. Your power steering lines here, you can see I've got a little bit of trickery going on here. I've got an AN6 line there mounted into the power steering, but I'll go over that in another video because I've actually changed a whole heap of stuff with the power steering, plumbing, and yeah, even, you know, we'll see a bit of it in this, but you can see I've got new lines all made up for the power steering and stuff here just to sort of help out with everything. I've actually got the alternator removed so that we can see sort of what's going on from the front. So that's the viewing from the front, looking through where the alternator normally sits. So you can see there our guys there. Reach up from underneath, get my hand in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go around this engine mount here. These are the BDE engine mounts, and we're going to sneak between the engine mount and this turbo inlet up there with our feed and return lines for it. Oh, that's a bit better. Okay, so you can see here, these are some riv nuts that I've put onto the chassis. These two here, that's what you call a fuck up. That's where I made a mistake on the first position for one of the hose mounts that I made, and that's the one that I'm actually using there. So, you know, we all make mistakes, and they're mine. But, you know, hopefully we'll paint over them. They won't really be sort of that noticeable. So we'll get these lines in. I'll sneak these through and I'll show you how I've managed to get around all this and where they go, and then how we kind of sneak through this area and get across into the front. And you'll see once I start putting all the bits and pieces back in there why it is such a problem. So I'll get these hoses just roughly shoved through there, and I'll give you something to look at. Right folks, I've got the two lines fitted, and you can see them there looking through the alternator space, mounted onto the thermostatic sandwich plate, and you can see how this kind of goes. One sneaks around behind the engine mount and the other one kind of goes over the top, and they rest there on that bracket that I showed you earlier, and you can see why these are so important to me, to be able to get me that exact position on the bracket there. But you can kind of see that one sneaks around behind the engine mount there, and the other one is sort of over the top. I can see it, but probably a bit hard for you guys to. Anyway, probably better from this side. But yeah, that's sort of where they go. So I'll get this this clamp tightened down on top of that, and that'll actually pull it away from that power steering hose there, right here. Whereas at the moment it's touching, but when I pull that clamp down, it'll kind of flatten the hose down and pull it away from that. And as you can see, there's no, it looks like it's kind of touching on things from here, but it's actually not. It's got at least 10 mil clearance between everything around there, and the hose, being that they're so stiff, it's once it's clamped down, it's not going to move on anything. And because it's running kind of sideways off the engine, as the engine rocks while it's being used, it's not pulling any tension on the hoses, it's just kind of pivoting them. So that should work out pretty well, I reckon. So I'll get that clamped down, and then we'll kind of move into this area here and work out how we're going to get the intercooler piping in and you know, everything else that sort of lives in that area. So I'll be back in a second, folks, with a little bit more done. That's the clamp part of that mount on, which just keeps that back section secured and exactly where we need it to be. Now we'll get into this guy next to the radiator. And this is where this guy goes, folks. You can see the hoses are sort of working their way along here. This arrangement that I made up here, this is how it kind of goes in. So it just kind of goes in like that. As you can see, going beside the radiator, it keeps the hoses just off the radiator there. So what I'll do now, folks, I'll get these bolts in there. So you can see there's a riv nut in that position that I've put in there with my super riv nut tool. And there's another one, where are we? On this side of it, under there. Lift that up, so there's another riv nut on there, to give me sort of a flat platform to then mount this bracket to, because it was just too irregular to be able to bolt anything on there. I ummed and ahed for a fair while with that one, working out how the hell I was going to do it. So I'll just slip these bolts in, folks, and then we'll go from there. Right. I'll get all this mounted, guys, and quite a few things need to go on together here to be able to sort of get this. So I'll get this all bolted up and we'll have another look at it. It's really hard for me to hold the phone and film this and kind of do stuff with one hand. If I go back to using the GoPro under here, the footage is just going to be absolutely terrible. So bear with me, folks. Just bear with me. I'll be back. So that's now bolted in, folks. You can see it's held very nice and securely. And you'll notice that it is like literally a bee's dick off the radiator there. So as close as I could possibly go without actually touching it. So it's not going to rub. And the next thing we're going to do is throw the intercooler pipe back on here, which runs from here, obviously up in here. And you'll get to see why that's mounted as close as it is there. So I think I'm going to revert back to the GoPro, folks, because I can put it on a mount. And we'll see how that goes. So you'll probably notice a drop in picture quality. But I'll be back and we'll fit that intercooler piping. So in order to get this in, folks, we've now got to push these pipes out of the way. Sneak this guy in somehow through here. Go on a bit of a wheel, I think. Oh yeah, there we go. And then just refit the bolt here into our original mount. Somewhere there. And you can now see how close that is, running up through there to get that through. The only area we have a bit of a gap is down here, but as you'll see shortly, that's about to become inaccessible. But you can see it all fits. It's all very nice and tight, so nothing's going to move. Intercooler piping is hard mounted to the body, so you know, none of this is going to move. There is clearance with the radiator, as you can see, not a lot, but it is there. And the next thing we're going to do is fit this part of the suspension under here. And the reason all this needs to be mounted up, folks, is it's another thing that you need to create clearance for with all of this. Because all of these things take up space and everything has to be clear of those lines. So this is the issue here, folks. You can see that the the line sits very close to that. It's not on it. You can see that by the fact that I can move it. Top one's fairly clear of it, but this is a really tight spot here. The hose had to be wrangled in a certain way so that it's pushing this way to keep it off that. And you've also got this line here where the sway bar comes through, so you can't hang this down any lower than where your sway bar comes through. You know, I've got clearance there, and it's all good. And the only other thing that's going on here is a hose separator, which will be mounted pretty much right there. So I'll just screw that on, and we'll have another look at that. Hose separator's now on, so it's now time to head into the front. And that's where we've come through now into the front, folks. You can see that's the other side of our bracket there, our bracket clamp arrangement. And we've now got to go up and attach it to our 34-row oil cooler, which you would have seen in one of the previous videos, how we made the brackets and everything to mount that. So I'll get the hoses hooked up onto that, then there's another hose separator to go on, and a couple of clearance areas which I'll point out to you. But I'll get these hoses attached, and then we'll look at a couple of other little things. Just put a little bit of lube on these threads, just because it's a little bit awkward. I do not want to gall anything up. Always good to take the pressure off these threads when you're trying to get stuff on, folks. They just do not like it if you are pushing against the side of them as you're kind of putting it together. So that's those guys roughly in the correct position. I'll just fit a hose separator, guys, down on here. And then I can just kind of tighten those down a little bit. The only other thing here, folks, that needs to be fitted is this pipe here that goes to your AC dryer up in this corner here. I have slightly manipulated the position of the AC dryer for other reasons, but that's kind of roughly where it ends up. It's this guy here. It just mounts on this bracket that I've made there, and then that pipe sort of screws into it. Just mounts in front of that intercooler pipe there. So we have clearance with everything, folks. So that's pretty much what it looks like finished now, folks. You can see that all goes through there nice and good. We've got clearance for everything. Nothing's hitting, nothing's even close. These lines sort of come up. They're going down there with plenty of clearance. Everything's, you know, it's held very good. There's not going to be any issues with it sort of moving around and rubbing on anything. But it did take a hell of a lot of work to get it to be like that, folks. Definitely not something that you could whip up in a couple of hours. You're talking, you know, a good few days of solid work to be able to get this whole setup to work like this. So that's my full flow oil cooler setup, folks. That's what I've done anyway. It's probably not what everyone would do, and I imagine people have got their own variation on the way that they've achieved this same outcome. But I just thought I'd show you what I've done, folks, just so that hopefully I could possibly save you guys a little bit of time trying to work through some of the issues that I had, and have managed to sort of work through to be able to get this whole thing to kind of fit. So that's about it for this video, folks. Next week I'll probably be making a bit of a video on the power steering lines. I've changed all of the power steering lines over to AN on the return line side, and I'm going to fit a power steering cooler to this thing. So I'm sure for some of you guys will probably find that interesting, but for now that's all we've got time for, folks. So as always, thanks for stopping by the Aussie Shed. Bloody pleasure to have you here. Hope you liked the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe to the channel, and as always, folks, I'll bloody well see you on the next one. Cheers.